Welcome to the Max Future Weekly Podcast. All Apple talk and no chit chat.
Okay, welcome to the Apple Podcast. This is episode 96. This is Lex at maxfuture.com, and today is November 4th, 2011. And we got all sorts of interesting Apple news to talk about, so let's get to it. Okay, so what's the first story we should talk about today on Friday, November 4th? Well, let's talk about Apple and what it's doing in-house. Now, one of the big news today on November 4th is that Apple has just awarded massive bonuses to its executives. And basically, its top executives are getting like hundreds of thousands of shares of options or stocks. And according to macrumors.com, Apple has awarded 1 million shares of stock to 7 top executives as a reward for their hard work during Apple's record fiscal year. And what's 1 million shares? Well, think of it this way: Apple stock's trading around $400 a share. So Apple dished out $400 million worth of stock. So this is pretty cool. So according to filings by Apple, the executives who got this include Eddie Q, who's in charge of the iTunes, music stuff. And he got 100,000 shares of stock in the form of a restricted stock unit, or RSU. These RSUs convert into freely tradable shares or stock. In other words, they vest in the future. So he gets 25% of his shares in September 2014 and 75% in September 2016. So he has an incentive to stick around. Other top executives who are getting the big bucks include Scott Forstall, who's the Senior Vice President of iOS Software, Bob Mansfield, who's the Senior Vice President of Hardware and Engineering, Peter Oppenheimer, who's the Senior Vice President and Chief Financial Officer, Phil Schiller, who's an SVP and Worldwide Product Marketing, and Bruce Sewell, who's a General Counsel, he's the lawyer, and Jeff Williams, who's the Head of Operations. And it's unclear what Tim Cook is going to get, or what Johnny Ive is going to get. Johnny Ive should certainly get something. So, these are, big bonuses for big executives because Apple had $100 billion in revenue. So it's pretty big reward for Steve Jobs' former lieutenants. So good work, guys. Well, really good news if you're a fan of Apple's most famous, or one of Apple's most famous stores, which is the Fifth Avenue store in New York. Because for several weeks, or months, Apple has had that boarded up with a big box over its famous glass cube. Why? Because Apple's renovating the famous glass cube. And today, on November 4th, Apple finally revealed the redesigned glass cube, and it's beautiful. Now, the website Cult of Mac has before and after pictures, and the main difference is that Apple has reduced the number of separate panes that make up the gigantic glass cube. Now, if you're not familiar with the Fifth Avenue store, the way it works is the Fifth Avenue store is underground in front of the former, or the GM building, which is around 59th Street and Fifth Avenue. And the glass cube is just on top of it, and you enter into it and you go down a staircase or an elevator. Now, what Apple has done is the original glass cube had 90 panes of glass, and the redesigned one is the same size with just 15. and there's no longer any sort of metal hinges or what are known as architectural crufts. They're not needed to support them, and so it looks cleaner, nicer, the pure glass Fifth Avenue design. So look, Steve Jobs was into beautiful aesthetics, and it's too bad that he died before this was revealed, because obviously this store was one of his favorites. It's one of the highest grossing retail stores in America. So if you're in New York or you're visiting New York, you should go to the Fifth Avenue store. I think it's the best one. It has the best service. And, it's definitely going to continue to be a major tourist attraction, as well as an attraction for Apple shoppers. Now, according to Mac Rumors and other websites, we're going to see major changes in the way Apple does business in these Apple stores. One of the things that's coming is you're going to be able to order online and then say that you're going to pick up in the store. So let's say you don't want the item shipped to your home because you don't have a doorman or someplace to leave it. You're going to be able to pick a store to ship it to, and you're also going to be able to return it to that store. So you're going to be able to buy online and then pick up your item from the store. And right now they sort of had a demo going with the New York stores and some other stores in California. Now, the other really cool thing is that the app that you have on the iPhone or iPad is going to be enhanced to allow you to do your own self-checkout when you're in an Apple store. So you're going to be able to, I guess, and I don't think it's going to be, with the computers and stuff, I guess you might be able to buy it and then they'll bring it from out back in the store. But for things that, that are out on the floor, you're going to be able to sort of scan it, I guess, with your iPhone and buy it and just walk out with it. Now, already, it's kind of loosey-goosey in the Apple stores because, there are these guys walking around, roaming around with the card scanners, and they'll say, hey, do you want to buy this headphone or iPad case or something? And they just scan your card, and they go, would you like us to email you the receipt? And so you just walk out with the item and you don't have a paper receipt. And it always feels kind of naked when you do that. But I guess the point is they have people at Apple looking around and make sure nobody shoplifts. So obviously Apple thinks this is going to work. And, but what I like about this is how much Apple trusts its customers. Because look at some other shopping experiences. When you leave a Costco store, they, at least in New York, they're constantly checking your receipt and then counting what you're walking out with to make sure you haven't taken too much. And it's the complete opposite at Apple. In fact, you don't even wait in line anywhere in Apple. There's people roaming around, and soon you're going to be able to just pick self-checkout. So I don't know why Apple's so confident in consumers not being crooks. Maybe it's because more affluent people who aren't going to steal are going to the Apple store. But I don't know. It just seems a totally different way of doing things than you see at these stores where they literally frisk you, when you're leaving. I mean, it's the same with the Home Depot store. Home Depot, you have to always show a receipt when you leave, which is kind of crazy. Anyways, these are exciting changes, and I think it's going to really help them in the shopping season. Now, one other piece of sort of intriguing news coming out of Apple is that its chief security guy, I guess sort of the policeman of Apple, has left. And sources say that he left, and I'm actually getting this from Reuters on the Chicago Tribune's website, say that this security chief named John Thorough has retired. And he had previously been the chief of security at Pfizer, and also worked at one point as a special agent for the FBI. And some people are suggesting that he left because of the sort of embarrassing thing that happened at Apple regarding the lost iPhone 4S prototype. Remember, Apple security staff was accompanied by San Francisco police and they went to the residence of the person that they thought took the prototype. And there's allegations that Apple, I guess, security officers pretended to be policemen, and they weren't. So it's possible. It's possible this guy was pushed out of Apple because maybe it hurt Apple's public image, and maybe they thought this guy's actions weren't appropriate. So, maybe Apple did the right thing if this guy acted improperly. Well, maybe there'll be more to the story. Now, as a business, Apple's iPhone continues to rock. Today, Forbes has a story out by Agostino Fontevecchia entitled Apple took 52% of the third quarter smartphone profits on only 4.2% market share. So think about that. Apple only has 4.2% of the global market, I guess, for smartphones, and Apple got a whopping percentage of the profits. So that's pretty impressive, because it goes to show you, maybe Apple has the premium end of the smartphone market. People are willing to pay a premium for the iPhone, and that's where the profits are. And I don't think, people are like, under some spell by Steve Jobs. I think they're just better phones. And I think what's going on is Android phones are sort of being dumped on the market at very low prices. Sure, there's some premium Android phones, but I think the vast majority of Android phones are sold very cheaply, like maybe even free with a 2-year plan. So anyways, Apple, I think Apple very cleverly has a small market share, but 52% of the industry profits. Very good for Apple. Now, one of the more intriguing stories that came out this week that really explains how Apple makes its incredible profits came out on Bloomberg Business Week, and there was an article entitled on November 3rd, Apple's Supply Chain Secret Hoard Lasers. And it's really a fascinating article by Adam Satariano and Peter Burrows. And basically, it gives the example of lasers. Now, apparently, I didn't really know this. I have a MacBook Air. But Apple has like a little small dot of green light above the screen, which indicates when its camera is on. And apparently you can barely see this light unless it's on. And Johnny Ive, he wanted to make it sort of very small and beautiful, and to do so you needed a laser. And they discovered a custom laser that could poke holes in the aluminum small enough to be nearly invisible to the human eye, but big enough to get light through. But here's how Apple makes money. Apparently, Apple uses its massive buying power to get suppliers to commit to supplying for a long time and at a low price. And they sort of lock up the supply chain. Now, I wonder if at some point this is going to be like an antitrust violation. If Apple's so massive and it can, acquire all the supply and prevent people from entering the market, is that anti-competitive? And in the article, it says that in the case of the lasers, each machine typically went for $250,000, and Apple convinced the seller to sign an exclusivity agreement and has since bought hundreds of them to make holes for the green lights that now shine on the company's MacBook Airs, trackpads, and wireless keyboards. So basically what they're saying is Apple has an incredible operational edge where it can lock up the supply chain and get a commitment. And a lot of that is the work of Tim Cook, who it was the chief operating officer and now is the CEO of Apple. So he's kind of like the genius behind really how to make profits, not just how to make the products, but how to make the products in mass and how to, lock everything up. So the article says, when it's time to go into production, Apple wields a big weapon more than $80 billion in cash and investments. The article says that Apple plans to nearly double capital expenditures on its supply chain in the next year to $7.1 billion, while committing another $2.4 billion in prepayments to key suppliers. So the article says that this tactic ensures availability and low prices for Apple and sometimes limits the options for everybody else. And it gives as an example about like the release of the iPhone 4 in June 2010, that rivals like HTC couldn't buy as many screens as they needed because manufacturers were busy filling Apple's orders. So it's kind of like a genius tactic by Apple. As it gets bigger and bigger, it can like sort of, zero in on supply of something critical to some new product. And it's a great way to play defense and prevents competitors from entering a market that you created. If you lock up all the supplies into the market and then that market's a hit, well, competitors can't really enter the market because they're not going to have any of the parts to get into it. So it's very clever. Now, the website and magazine PC World reports that Apple's not really worried about one competitor, and that's Amazon with its Kindle Fire. And there's an article out on November 4th by a guy named Ben Cam Jones, who says that Apple bosses are taking a positive view of the newest entrant to the tablet PC market rather than feeling challenged by it. Well, this is at least what they're claiming. Business Insider reports that Barclays analyst Ben Wright met with Tim Cook and Peter Oppenheimer, both of whom believe that the Kindle Fire will prove disruptive among the Android tablet market. So disruptive means it's going to damage the Android tablet market. And the article points out that the Kindle Fire, which is priced at $199 and due in the United States on November 21st, is a lot cheaper than other Android-based tablets. So this could lead to fragmentation of the Android market. And also because it's the apps will look different on the Kindle Fire than on other Android tablets. It says that developers may find themselves in a position where they have to create one version of an app for Android tablets and another for the Kindle Fire. So I think, obviously Tim Cook and Peter Oppenheimer aren't going to say that the Kindle Fire is a massive threat. So they're going to try to spin it like that they're not worried about it. Sort of like how a prize fighter talks who's ahead in boxing. So we'll have to see how well the Fire does. It's going to come out fairly soon. Okay, so as I told you last week, I was reading the new Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, and there's really some interesting stuff in there. And some of the stuff in there has got me thinking on something kind of cool about, all these lawsuits that are going on against Google. And so I've been working on a post called "Did Larry Ellison Help Out His Pal Steve Jobs by Purchasing Sun and Suing Google?" Now, as some of you may know, Oracle, which is a very large enterprise computer company and was founded by Larry Ellison, and Larry Ellison is the CEO of Oracle and one of the world's, and is the third wealthiest American citizen. And Oracle is currently in a very nasty lawsuit against Google, in which it alleges that Google's Android software is infringing patents that are held by Oracle. And the patents concern the Java programming language that was developed by Sun. Now, in January 2010, Oracle acquired Sun and now owns those Sun patents. Oracle is seeking billions of dollars in damages. After reading Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs and other info on the web, I'm starting to think that Larry Ellison may have gone after Google and Android because of his close friendship with Steve Jobs. Oracle has valid reasons to protect those patents it acquired when it purchased Sun, But Ellison appears to be a very passionate guy and a very loyal friend, and it's very possible that he was motivated in suing Google because of his close friendship with Steve Jobs. Now, here are some facts from the book and other places which show what good friends Ellison and Jobs were. Isaacson says that in 1995, when Jobs was in exile from Apple, Ellison threw a 40th birthday party for Jobs, and that, quote, Ellison had become a close friend, and he would often take the Jobs family out on one of his many luxurious yachts, end quote. That comes from the book. In the 1990s, as Pixar, which Jobs owned, was developing its first hit, Toy Story, Jobs showed many early versions of the developing movie to Ellison and other friends to get feedback. Quote, I can tell you the number of versions of Toy Story I saw before it came out, end quote, said Larry Ellison. Now, Isaacson also says that in the 1990s, when Jobs was in exile from Apple, Ellison offered to launch a hostile takeover of Apple so that Jobs could return and run the company. Jobs declined that offer and found other means to return to Apple and regain control of the company he created. In 1997, Ellison was made a director of Apple after Steve Jobs came back to the company. And Ellison resigned as a director in 2002, saying he was too busy. In December 2003, Steve Jobs and his wife attended Larry Ellison's intimate wedding to his fourth wife. Jobs, described as Ellison's best friend, also acted as the wedding photographer. And after Jobs returned to Apple, he sometimes used Ellison's private plane, and when Ellison was on Apple's board of directors, he argued in favor of Apple giving Jobs his own private plane. And then, at Jobs' behest, Ellison and Oracle were instrumental in developing Apple's great point-of-sales checkout system in Apple stores. Now, my whole point in pointing all of this out is to just show that they're good friends with each other. Now, that's part one of my theory. Here's part two. Jobs was absolutely livid at Google and Android and vowed to have a thermonuclear war. And Isaacson's book reveals that Steve Jobs was extremely livid at Google and its Android phones. And Jobs conceded the following to Isaacson regarding Apple's many patent lawsuits against Google's Android partners. This is what Steve Jobs said, according to Walter Isaacson. Our lawsuit is saying, Google, you fucking ripped off the iPhone. Wholesale ripped us off. Grand theft. I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go to thermonuclear war on this. They are scared to death because they know they are guilty. Outside of search, Apple products, Google products, Android, Google Docs are, and then he says, our shit. So, look, obviously Steve Jobs was furious at Google and Android. And also remember, part of the reason he was furious because Google was Apple's ally, and Google's CEO, Eric Schmidt, was on Apple's board at the time that Apple was developing the iPhone. So, given how furious he was, don't you think it's possible that he confided in his friend Larry Ellison and vented to him and said, and told Larry Ellison how much he was pissed off at Google and the Android stuff? Of course he did. I'm sure he did. If he was talking to Larry Ellison, I'm sure he was complaining to him. And here it gets even more interesting because we know that Larry Ellison is extremely loyal. And remember, he was going to launch a hostile takeover to get Steve Jobs back into Apple in the 90s. But look, even more recently, Larry Ellison is like tennis buddies with Hurd, who was the head of Hewlett-Packard. When Hurd got pushed out of Hewlett-Packard because of a scandal involving some woman, Larry Ellison criticized Hewlett-Packard and hired Hurd, and he's now an executive at Oracle. Similarly, Google. Well, here's what's interesting: the iPhone was launched in 2007, and I guess in 2008 or 2009 there were stirrings of Android, and it was right about then that Oracle went out and started acquiring Sun. And Oracle didn't close and complete the purchase of Sun till the beginning of 2010, which is really when Android started really doing, well. And, okay, Oracle probably has legitimate reasons to acquire Sun, but once it acquired Sun, Oracle had these patents, the Java patents, which apparently Google didn't properly license and are in Android, and Oracle has completely sued Google, seeking billions of dollars. So all I'm saying is, while Larry Ellison and Oracle may have their own good reason from a business point of view to sue Google and to acquire Sun, it's also very possible that Larry Ellison was motivated by helping out his friend, Steve Jobs. Maybe he saw that he could do two things, kill two birds with one stone. He could revenge Steve Jobs, and he could make a lot of money. So we'll see how that lawsuit pans out, but I think it's a pretty viable theory that I have. Okay, so as I told you last week, I was reading the new Steve Jobs biography by Walter Isaacson, and there's really some interesting stuff in there. And some of the stuff in there has got me thinking on something kind of cool about, all these lawsuits that are going on against Google. And so I've been working on a post called "Did Larry Ellison Help Out His Pal Steve Jobs by Purchasing Sun and Suing Google?" Now, as some of you may know, Oracle, which is a very large enterprise computer company and was founded by Larry Ellison, and Larry Ellison is the CEO of Oracle and one of the world's, and is the third wealthiest American citizen. And Oracle is currently in a very nasty lawsuit against Google, in which it alleges that Google's Android software is infringing patents that are held by Oracle. And the patents concern the Java programming language that was developed by Sun. Now, in January 2010, Oracle acquired Sun and now owns those Sun patents. Oracle is seeking billions of dollars in damages. After reading Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs and other info on the web, I'm starting to think that Larry Ellison may have gone after Google and Android because of his close friendship with Steve Jobs. Oracle has valid reasons to protect those patents it acquired when it purchased Sun, but Ellison appears to be a very passionate guy and a very loyal friend, and it's very possible that he was motivated in suing Google because of his close friendship with Steve Jobs. Now, here are some facts from the book and other places which show what good friends Ellison and Jobs were. Isaacson says that in 1995, when Jobs was in exile from Apple, Ellison threw a 40th birthday party for Jobs, and that, quote, Ellison had become a close friend, and he would often take the Jobs family out on one of his many luxurious yachts, end quote. That comes from the book. In the 1990s, as Pixar, which Jobs owned, was developing its first hit, Toy Story, Jobs showed many early versions of the developing movie to Ellison and other friends to get feedback. Quote, "I can tell you the number of versions of Toy Story I saw before it came out," end quote, said Larry Ellison. Now, Isaacson also says that in the 1990s, when Jobs was in exile from Apple, Ellison offered to launch a hostile takeover of Apple so that Jobs could return and run the company. Jobs declined that offer and found other means to return to Apple and regain control of the company he created. In 1997, Ellison was made a director of Apple after Steve Jobs came back to the company. And Ellison resigned as a director in 2002, saying he was too busy. In December 2003, Steve Jobs and his wife attended Larry Ellison's intimate wedding to his fourth wife. Jobs, described as Ellison's best friend, also acted as the wedding photographer. And after Jobs returned to Apple, he sometimes used Ellison's private plane, and when Ellison was on Apple's board of directors, he argued in favor of Apple giving Jobs his own private plane. And then, at Jobs' behest, Ellison and Oracle were instrumental in developing Apple's great point-of-sales checkout system in Apple stores. Now, my whole point in pointing all of this out is to just show that they're good friends with each other. Now, that's part one of my theory. Here's part two. Jobs was absolutely livid at Google and Android and vowed to have a thermonuclear war. And Isaacson's book reveals that Steve Jobs was extremely livid at Google and its Android phones. And Jobs conceded the following to Isaacson regarding Apple's many patent lawsuits against Google's Android partners. This is what Steve Jobs said, according to Walter Isaacson. Our lawsuit is saying, Google, you fucking ripped off the iPhone. Wholesale ripped us off. Grand theft. I will spend my last dying breath if I need to, and I will spend every penny of Apple's $40 billion in the bank to right this wrong. I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go to thermonuclear war on this. They are scared to death because they know they are guilty. Outside of search, Apple products, Google products, Android, Google Docs are, and then he says, our shit. So, look, obviously Steve Jobs was furious at Google and Android. And also remember, part of the reason he was furious because Google was Apple's ally. And Google's CEO, Eric Schmidt, was on Apple's board at the time that Apple was developing the iPhone. So, given how furious he was, don't you think it's possible that he confided in his friend Larry Ellison and vented to him and said, and told Larry Ellison how much he was pissed off at Google and the Android stuff? Of course he did. I'm sure he did. If he was talking to Larry Ellison, I'm sure he was complaining to him. And here it gets even more interesting because we know that Larry Ellison is extremely loyal. And remember, he was going to launch a hostile takeover to get Steve Jobs back into Apple in the 90s. But look, even more recently, Larry Ellison is like tennis buddies with Hurd, who was the head of Hewlett-Packard. When Hurd got pushed out of Hewlett-Packard because of a scandal involving some woman, Larry Ellison criticized Hewlett-Packard and hired Hurd, and he's now an executive at Oracle. Similarly, Google. Well, here's what's interesting. The iPhone was launched in 2007, and I guess in 2008 or 2009, there were stirrings of Android, and it was right about then that Oracle went out and started acquiring Sun. And Oracle didn't close and complete the purchase of Sun till the beginning of 2010, which is really when Android started really doing, well. And, okay, Oracle probably has legitimate reasons to acquire Sun, but once it acquired Sun, Oracle had these patents, the Java patents, which apparently Google didn't properly license and are in Android, and Oracle has completely sued Google, seeking billions of dollars. So all I'm saying is, while Larry Ellison and Oracle may have their own good reason from a business point of view, to sue Google and to acquire Sun. It's also very possible that Larry Ellison was motivated by helping out his friend, Steve Jobs. Maybe he saw that he could do two things, kill two birds with one stone. He could revenge Steve Jobs, and he could make a lot of money. So we'll see how that lawsuit pans out, but I think it's a pretty viable theory that I have. Now, lately I've been reading a lot about Steve Jobs. Obviously, I read that book, the Walter Isaacson book, and I've just been, watching other documentaries on Steve Jobs and interviews of him over the years. And one comment he made sort of stuck in my mind. I guess in the mid-90s, he gave an interview. This is when he was at Next, and he was just talking about his career and all that. And he talked about how early in his life, he realized that all this stuff that we have in our life, all these gadgets, all the technologies, everything that we have were made by people. And that he realized that the people who made it aren't necessarily smarter than he is or smarter than people. It's just that, and that was a big realization for him, and so something else stuck in my mind. I've been reading the history of the Wright brothers, Oliver and Wendell Wright, who invented the airplane. And their lives struck me as being kind of parallel to Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs' life. Because if you think about it, what's truly amazing about Steve Jobs and Wozniak is that, they were just sort of like smart, curious, everyday people. But they weren't, in other words, these huge breakthroughs in the world. Let's take the invention of the airplane and the invention of the personal computer were essentially done by amateur hackers. And that's kind of ironic here because Apple obviously doesn't like people jailbreaking the iPhone. And it's kind of ironic that Steve Jobs is such a control freak and doesn't want hacking when in some way he invented hacking, or he was a hacker himself. Because if you think about it, the original personal computer is a form of hacking. And it's really taking together other parts that are out there already and assembling them and making a personal computer. Now, take the first Apple computer. Steve Wozniak was the real engineer there. But he was a tinkerer. Steve Wozniak liked to tinker with electronics and engineering and go by parts and put things together. And he would read Popular Mechanics and other scientific magazines and just dream of building something with the components. And Steve Jobs, his father, when Steve Jobs was young, the father who adopted him, Mr. Jobs, was a really good mechanic. He hadn't gone to college, but he was a really good mechanic. He loved to tinker, and he had a tinker bench, a workbench in the garage, and he gave Steve part of that. And also his dad was fantastic at going to part sales, automobile part sales and stuff, and find parts and realize what their value was and then resell them. So Steve Jobs learned his sort of entrepreneurial skills there. Now, earlier, a couple of days ago, I read to my son the sort of a nice book on the Wright brothers, and it struck me that, wow, something? The Wright brothers are really sort of like Steve and Steve. In other words, there's such a parallel there, and here's the parallel. The Wright brothers, they didn't, they sort of stumbled into, building the first airplane. They were actually sort of curious people who sort of hacked around, and the brothers were very close. And their dad was a minister who traveled around, but his dad was kind of an entrepreneur. They were in Ohio, and his dad had a religious newspaper that he was selling around the country. And the Wright brothers actually were together, Wilbur and Oliver, they they got into other businesses before they even got into the hobby of making an airplane. They made, first I think they started out with a printing press, like to make, prints for local businessmen. And they sort of hacked together a better printing press by going and finding parts. Now, if you think about it, that technology, the printing press in the late 19th century, isn't that the same as like the personal computer in the 1970s? In other words, it's technology. We look at a printing press now and think, oh, what's the big deal? It's not really technology. But imagine how exciting it must have been before there was a printing press and somebody came up with a cheap way to print, because suddenly it's liberating. You can suddenly offer a service cheaper and freer, and people can take advantage of it. And that's what the two Wright brothers did in Ohio for local businesses. They started this business doing printing, and selling the prints. And they sort of stumbled into it because, one of them sort of got like a job doing one thing and then saw you could do it and do it better. And so neither of them really went to college, but they figured out, actually, no, one went to college and one didn't, because he lost his teeth in a hockey accident and he felt self-conscious. But then here's the thing. The Wright brothers, at a very young age, they have this printing business, and then they see the bicycles. And this is where it gets interesting. So the Wright brothers, they start a bicycle repair shop because they're good at repairing bicycles. I mean, first let me back off. They obviously, bikes were new. They were brand new things. So think of it like, geeks. They were geeks back then. So there was this new gadget called a bicycle, and the first bicycles were like these huge wheels in the front and a little wheel in the back, and people kept falling off. But then somebody invented safe bikes, which are what we have now, like bikes with the same size wheel. And the Wright brothers got into that. They were biking around, and then they were handy, so they were able to repair these bikes pretty easily. And they started a shop across the street. So they had all these businesses, and it seems like because they were curious and could sense where there was a new opportunity with a new technology, they thrived. And the brothers were very close. Now, at a young age, they were enamored with the concept of flying. So they decided they were going to sort of explore building an airplane. And they had read about other people experimenting with gliders in Europe. And, up till then, there were a lot of people experimenting with gliders. But the idea was, a glider that would be self-motorized that could stay in the air. And what's incredible, if you think about it, these two guys never had any experience flying. In fact, nobody had experience. And they just started experimenting as hackers with the technology that was out there to make a better glider that could turn. So first they did that, and then they just kept experimenting and researching. And it was almost like a hobby, two geeks, to see if they could get a glider with the right motor to fly. And if you look at this, it's not like, oh, they're just two scientists who sort of, were in a research area and decided to build a plane, but rather they were just like everyday people who just were hackers back then and had an interest in creating something and thinking that it could be done with the technology that was out there. And isn't that really what the two Steves did with the first Apple computer? I mean, there was technology out there. Intel was cranking out processors that were now feasible for smaller computers. And there was this technology out there with the bigger computers. And basically, Wozniak wanted, because he was a hacker, he wanted his own computer. It must have been very frustrating having to go to a big mainframe computer. And the Altair had come out. And so really, what the two Steves did is push the envelope on the technology, what was out there, envisioning what they wanted, and then going and building it. And if you think about what made Apple ultimately very successful, is that Steve Jobs, once Apple became successful with the Apple II and made a lot of money, Steve Jobs, the products that were successful was him pushing the envelope, like seeing what components are out there and then envisioning something that he would want. And this is why he never did product interviews and stuff like that. So I think that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak are sort of like the Wright brothers in the sense that their passion together created the first personal computer and the Apple II. But in some ways, Steve Jobs surpassed Wozniak and the Wright brothers because, Wozniak and the Wright brothers were all great at that initial breakthrough. But like take the Wright brothers, they weren't great afterwards into sort of building that breakthrough of creating the first airplane and patenting it into a real successful massive business. And this is where Steve really excelled. And to some ways he sort of drifted apart from Wozniak because Wozniak didn't really have interest in building a giant company. Wozniak's genius was he loved the breakthrough of creating a product. Steve Jobs liked the breakthrough of creating a product because then he could build a company. And the Wright brothers, they liked the breakthrough of having the first airplane just because of the sheer brilliance of doing it. But Steve Jobs then, once he, had a company and had a successful product, he longed to keep hitting home runs. And we know he then went on, was kicked out of Apple in the 80s and started Next and Pixar. But his genius in a way was sort of seeing what's out there, seeing what's like what could be very valuable in a home run to society, and then doing everything to push it and get it done. Like they take it Pixar. He acquired Pixar, was an animation company that George Lucas had, and really when he bought it from George Lucas, the company's purpose was to build special computers for animation. And making movies was really just a side hobby, I think, of Lasseter, one of the principles there. And the company was sort of floundering, but Lasseter made a short movie, which was the precursor to Toy Story. And the short movie won an Academy Award. And Jobs saw that, wow, this movie won an Academy Award. Let's maybe make a bigger movie. And, and sort of ran with it and partnered with Disney. And here's the interesting thing. Disney, seeing the short film, wanted Lasseter to go back to Disney to make movies, animated movies. But Lasseter, even though Steve Jobs was so difficult, was loyal, wanted to stay with Steve Jobs. So instead, there's a deal between Pixar and Disney, and the rest is history. Lasseter makes Toy Story 2, car movie, all these great movies. Pixar becomes a gigantic money machine for Disney. Steve eventually sells Pixar to Disney and becomes a multi-billionaire. He becomes a multi-billionaire not because of Apple, but because of Pixar. But my point here with Steve Jobs is that he continued to be hungry to find that next breakthrough product. So he's not like Mr. Inventor sitting around inventing stuff, but rather he's the guy who can see what the engineers are doing, who can see what the component people are getting, and then, pushing forward and creating a new product. And the iPod was that. There were MP3 players before the iPod came out in October 2001, but they were limited. They were limited because they didn't have a lot of memory. You could only put maybe 10, 12 songs on it, and it had a terrible interface. And I remember the iPod, to me, the big breakthrough was that it was clean, beautiful interface, easy to control, and it had a 5 gigabyte hard drive. Now, there was one other company, I think, that had a hard drive MP3 player. I think Kobe or Arcos or something like that had a 5 gigabyte MP3 player, but it was much bigger and heavier than the iPod, the first iPod, and it was clunky. And so Apple coming out, with a much better 5 gigabyte hard drive and Apple behind it, was able to just really dominate the MP3 market, because anybody interested in MP3s now really wanted an iPod because it could hold thousands of songs, and that was the big breakthrough. And they gave you technology to help rip your music off your CD and put it on your iPad. And so again, it's in a way, think about the Wright Brothers. The Wright Brothers, there was technology there to make an airplane. There was equipment to make an airplane, to make an engine. They assembled it and implemented it into an airplane. There was technology there to make a PC in 1976. But Wozniak, with the exuberance of Jobs, created that first PC. And there was technology out there to create a better smartphone. That's the iPhone. But it was really Steve who pushed it to be there and to make it great. His motto was to make it insanely great. And that's what he strived for, was to make products that were insanely great. And it's that kind of drive that is just, something I think that distinguishes him from all great people, because a lot of great people, they do one great thing early in their life and then they fade. And Steve Jobs did not do that. He did multiple great things throughout his life. And it's really, I think it's very inspirational and can be a blueprint for other people to be inspired. Anyways, that's what I have to say. One of the crazier pieces of news that came out on November 4th late at night was a report from Foss Patents, a guy who follows the patent wars between Apple and Motorola and other companies. And the headline was that Motorola won a permanent injunction or patent injunction in Germany against Apple. And so a lot of people thought, oh, wow, Motorola is enjoining Apple from selling products in Germany. But Nilay Patel at the new website, TheVerge.com, had a great immediate retort, which pointed out that it was only a technical injunction. It doesn't mean anything. And here's what Nilay Patel wrote. He said, the international patent wars seem to have gotten far hotter for a moment this evening, as Foss Patents reported that Motorola Mobility had won a German injunction against Apple that could theoretically prevent the company from selling its various products. But he points out that that's not what really happened. And basically, he says it's just a symbolic injunction. He points out that Apple in Germany is represented by two organizations, Apple Inc., the worldwide corporate parent, and Apple Germany. And it's the local subsidiary, Apple Germany, that actually sells products to consumers. And Motorola Mobility, according to Nilay Patel, filed lawsuits against both organizations. And while Apple Germany vigorously is fighting the case, Apple lawyers let Apple Inc.'s lawsuit slide, resulting in this default judgment, an injunction. Now, a default judgment is when someone sues you and you do nothing to defend it. The other side can get a default, and that's what happened. And it doesn't mean much, because in most countries, you can undo a default by going back to court and saying, look, give us another chance. We missed some filing date, or we didn't get it in the mail, or just, because courts don't like defaults. And Apple said here in its official statement, this is a procedural issue that has nothing to do with the merits of this case. This does not affect our ability to sell products or do business in Germany at this time. So this could have been an oversight by an attorney at Apple, or it might have been done purposely, but it's not a big deal. So if you're an Apple investor or if you are a customer, you shouldn't be too concerned about this so-called German patent injunction. Okay, so now let me give a plug for what I think is one of the coolest products to come out in a long time. And plug is the right word, because the product is something called Plugbug. And this is a genius little device. And what it is this. Don't you find it to be a pain when you have, let's say, an iPad and a MacBook Air and the charges are different? For example, the MacBook Air has a standard Macintosh charger, but that charger won't work with an iPad. So you got two chargers. And why can't Apple just make, one that works with both? Now, remember, the iPad has to run on a higher USB wattage of 10 watts. So what is Plugbug? It's this ingenious device that can be attached to a Macintosh charger and then provide a 10-watt USB outlet from the Mac charger that will allow you to then charge the iPad while simultaneously charging a Mac, such as a MacBook Air. And if you look at the video version of this, it's made by a company called 12south.com, and it is red. It's striking red. I wonder why they made it striking red. Maybe they were afraid of lawsuits from Apple if they made it white, because then it would look like an Apple product. So it's really cool, and you basically just plug it into, that there's part of the Mac the Mac charger, the Macintosh charger, where you can take it out and plug in a different connection. That allows you to connect foreign connections. And there's a video on YouTube where Guy Kawasaki really is plugging this device, and I think it's one of the coolest products to come out in a long time. It's called the Plugbug, and it's $34.99, and to me it's kind of a cool device, particularly if you're traveling and you only have one outlet to charge from. This allows you to charge from just one charger. So I may get it. It looks very cool, and I think I think it's a great device. So that's my tip for the day. Get the Plugbug. Okay, thanks for listening to the Apple Podcast. Actually, I recorded this on Friday, November 4th, but it took me a while to get the post-production stuff done, so it didn't come out till Saturday, November 5th. Thanks for listening. This is Lex at maxfuture.com, and see you next week.